In an age when Europe believed the Mediterranean belonged solely to its crowns, one name alone silenced hearts, emptied harbors, and reduced proud maps into drifting ashes. Inside the silk war tents of Spanish kings, his name emerged only in terrified whispers, as though speaking louder might summon calamity itself across the haunted Mediterranean horizon. He was not born beneath palace domes, nor carried royal blood through noble veins, but beside a humble potter's furnace upon Lesbos, where destiny shaped empires from clay. The island of Lesbos, a lonely fragment scattered upon the Mediterranean map, became his first cradle, while its savage waves instructed him that oceans spare neither weakness nor strength. His father, Jacob, molded wet clay with fractured hands, while young Aruj watched silently before lifting his gaze toward horizons far greater than pottery and earthly ceilings. Three brothers matured beneath roaring tides, salted winds, and the language of storms. Aru, Khair al-Din, and Ishak Yetzeru alone became the blazing torch illuminating their path forward. The crimson beard that granted him the legendary title Barbarossa became more than mere appearance. It was a moving banner of terror preceding his ships across terrified waters. Aruj was never the commander who distributed orders from safety's distant shadow. He remained the first blade vaulting walls, trusting destiny itself to shield his soul from death. His reputation traveled days ahead of his fleet, and whenever crimson banners appeared across distant waters, merchant vessels scattered like frightened doves fleeing a descending iron hawk. His mission stretched far beyond plundered treasure and glittering spoils. It sought restoration of shattered Islamic dignity, stolen from Andalusia through fire, steel, exile, and unspeakable betrayal. The displaced Muslims of Andalusia raised trembling hands toward heaven and uttered his name before sultans, because he alone extended salvation across the blue abyss, dividing their worlds forever. Aruj carried more scars upon his body than stars above clear Mediterranean nights, and every wound became another chapter written by war directly upon his flesh and spirit. Whoever witnessed Aruj Barbarossa standing upon his vessel while crimson beard whipped beneath storm winds understood instantly that certain men enter existence solely to redirect the course of nations. His voice thundered above crashing storms and battlefield screams alike, while commands reached his warriors faster than wind itself, because they believed their vanguard commander never lost direction. European hatred toward him exceeded ordinary warfare and rivalry. It became existential dread before a man daring openly to proclaim the Mediterranean would never belong solely to Christian empires. The Ottoman-Turkish blood flowing through his veins was not simple ancestry, but a militant creed declaring Muslims possessed equal rights upon seas, skies, and the world itself. The Mediterranean memory bears his name carved through fire and salt within every harbor assaulted, every vessel halted, and every Andalusian captive returned to freedom through impossible waters. The Spanish crowns recorded him among enemies of the realm, while exiled Andalusians engraved his memory deeper still, preserving him eternally as their guiding star through darkness and exile. His shadow often arrived before his fleet itself, and sometimes his absence proved deadlier than his presence, because authentic terror requires memory far more than bullets or cannons. This is not merely the tale of a corsair lusting after ivory, gold, and silk, but an epic concerning a man born chained, living solely to shatter chains. Before hearing of Khair al-Din, who later humbled Europe itself, one must first understand Aruj, because without the elder brother's sacrifice, the Mediterranean legend would never blossom afterward. At the dawn of the 16th century, the Spanish Empire cast its monstrous shadow across the Islamic West, while American gold flooded endlessly through arteries financing Mediterranean conquest and domination. Andalusia had fallen during 1492, yet its Muslims still concealed Qurans and identities beneath the infernal machinery of inquisitions, where refusal meant fire, impalement, exile, or oblivion itself. Across the Mediterranean, the Knights of St. John crouch within Rhodes like venomous scorpions inside Islamic waters, suffocating Muslim navigation beneath chains forged from relentless maritime blockades and terror. Venice, Genoa, Spain, and the papacy together tightened steel cords around the Mediterranean, convinced the Islamic West had already been buried forever beneath history's collapsing ruins and silence. Within this suffocating nightmare emerged Aruj adventure, not during triumph or prosperity, but amid humiliation and captivity, when enemies believed they had silenced his voice forever beneath iron chains. The Knights of St. John captured the young Aruj and chained him upon galley benches inside Rhodes, that fortress Europe considered utterly impossible to escape or ever truly challenge. 3 brutal years enslaved upon hostile galleys became Aruj's university rather than his prison, teaching him enemy weaknesses, storm navigation, and the hidden architecture of vengeance and survival. Chains never shattered his spirit. Instead, they forged it harder, tempering his soul through humiliation's furnace until he emerged sharper and deadlier than the swords surrounding his captivity. When he escaped imprisonment, some chronicles claiming Khayr al-Din himself sailed fearlessly to rescue him, Aruj carried only one vow, burning inside his chest: repayment through blood. North Africa during that era trembled between collapsing sultanates and frightened princes incapable of protecting coastlines, much less preserving memory itself from permanent erasure beneath imperial occupation and decay. The Hafids of Tunis accepted Aruj merely as a practical ally paying tribute, granting him La Goulette harbor as foundation for ambitions history would later remember as legendary transformation. He began with only 2 vessels facing the colossal fleets of empires. Yet within his spirit existed inexhaustible reserves of determination beyond confiscation, negotiation, exhaustion, or surrender, before destiny itself. His first spoils were 2 papal ships, as though fate intended the potter's son to direct his opening blow straight toward Europe's spiritual throne and imperial arrogance alike. The displaced Andalusians, scattered across North African shores, rushed toward him like drowning souls clutching drifting timber, because he alone dared return them safely across murderous waters and blockade. Aruj accomplished what countless princes and sultans utterly failed to achieve, penetrating fortified Spanish coastlines and rescuing thousands of Andalusian Muslims, men, women, children, and elders alike from annihilation. Historians estimate his repeated rescue expeditions saved between 10,000 and 70,000 Muslim lives, redefining courage itself and restoring meaning to loyalty toward faith, civilization, and shattered peoples. Yet glory breeds enemies exactly as sunlight breeds shadows, and every triumph expanded the coalition determined to extinguish this crimson flame. Spain, the papacy, and Rhodes united together. Battles accumulated like geological layers through passing years, while Algeria's coastline slowly transformed from abandoned frontier into a living arena of resistance, power, endurance, and defiant maritime will. All Europe regarded Aruj as an impossible phenomenon beyond comprehension. How could a potter's son lacking royal ancestry build naval power terrifying the mightiest kingdoms upon earth and history? The Siege of Bejaia, that heavily fortified Algerian coastal city beneath Spanish dominion, became Aruj's first true trial against trained garrisons and cannons designed to annihilate ambition itself completely. During 1512, Aruj positioned his artillery before Bejaia's defiant stone walls and confronted Spanish forces whose ammunition, fortifications, and experience vastly exceeded anything available within his struggling ranks. Within that infernal siege, Aruj descended personally toward frontline positions, overseeing battle directly, until the merciless bullet destined to transform legend forever tore violently through his right arm. His right arm was severed before the horrified eyes of soldiers whose breathing nearly stopped. Yet Aruj neither screamed nor retreated, instead raising remaining arm and roaring onward defiantly. The first failed siege became merely another unfinished chapter, because truly great men distinguish between temporary defeat that teaches wisdom and permanent defeat that buries civilizations beneath irreversible darkness forever. With one remaining arm and determination multiplied by suffering itself, Aruj returned toward the sea, later crafting for himself a pure silver limb replacing what war had stolen. That silver arm became far more than compensation for physical loss. It stood as declaration toward enemies that flesh may perish while human will remains utterly unconquerable before history itself. His influence expanded eastward and westward across Algeria's endless coastline, while reputation transformed into a magnet drawing Turks, Amazigh warriors, Andalusians, and every soul-believing ocean's deserved sacrifice and blood. In 1516, desperate cries reached Aruj from devastated Algiers. Spanish forces tightened iron control over offshore strongholds, while Emir Salim al-Tumi stood powerless before mounting catastrophe and fear. The appeal matched visions haunting Aruj for years already. Algiers represented the grand foundation from which his fleet would challenge Europe's suffocating blockade and maritime tyranny across Mediterranean waters. Aruj entered Algiers in a scene resembling myth itself. White turban crowning his head, while unquenchable fire blazed within his eyes behind ranks of battle-hardened warriors, advancing silently onward. Emir Salim imagined he had summoned merely another obedient instrument serving his authority. Yet Aruj belonged to nobody, and soon the ruler realized mountains themselves had begun collapsing upon him. Aruj removed the emir from power through astonishingly bold calculation, understanding that genuine strength cannot emerge beneath collapsing foundations, and that empires require clean beginnings forged entirely from nothingness and resolve. Aruj gathered scholars, merchants, and tribal elders before declaring clearly that Algiers would no longer remain a forgotten emirate, but become headquarters for relentless resistance against Mediterranean imperial domination forever. Consolidating authority over Algiers proved no peaceful triumph whatsoever. Competing tribes, clashing interests, and hostile neighboring cities generated immense pressure from every direction surrounding his fragile new dominion entirely. Yet years of captivity and savage seas taught him alliances are forged through shared interests before fleeting emotions. So he wove loyalty among Amazigh tribes using justice, respect, and kinship. Tlemcen stood opposing him openly, while its Zionid ruler dispatched desperate pleas toward Spanish authorities in Oran, warning that Aruj's expanding shadow threatened to devour every surrounding city entirely. The Spanish responded with massive armies commanded by the Marquis of Comares' 10,000 professional soldiers, with cannons, cavalry, and imperial arrogance, marching confidently to restore Mediterranean dominance through overwhelming force. The mountainous road between Algiers and Tlemcen was not reckless improvisation, but carefully designed entrapment, because harsh terrain neutralized numerical superiority and redistributed battlefield balance toward experienced defenders and survivalists. His intimate knowledge of Algerian mountain passages granted advantages unavailable through manpower alone. Narrow valleys transformed enormous invading armies into stumbling beasts, while mobility itself became his deadliest tactical weapon. Yet destiny refused allowing genius alone to dictate every battle, and overwhelming Spanish numbers eventually crushed intricate strategies beneath iron pressure closing around Tlemcen like predatory claws around helpless prey. The prolonged siege of Tlemcen exhausted supplies, narrowed choices, and announced clearly this confrontation would transcend ordinary tactical maneuvering, becoming instead the gravest decision of Aruj entire turbulent existence and legacy. The heaviest decision was never whether to fight, but how withdrawing forces might survive before encirclement evolved into complete annihilation, erasing the entire project from history's memory forever and completely. Aruj ordered remaining soldiers retreat toward Algiers and join his beloved brother Khayr al-Din, whose survival represented protection for a future Ari already understood he would never personally witness. While his troops withdrew toward Algiers, Aruj remained behind alongside loyal companions, forming a human shield against relentless Spanish assaults, retreating step by step toward inevitable martyrdom and immortal remembrance. Wadi al-Mali, that forgotten Algerian valley of dust, rock, and silence witnessed during May 1518, a sight history itself could never erase, a commander knowingly choosing death while still standing upright. Spanish forces finally surrounded Aru after battle, concluded the narrative beginning years earlier upon hostile galley benches, and what fitting conclusion for a man never ceasing resistance even for moments. Aruj Barbarossa fell during that final battle, having fulfilled his true purpose entirely. Khayr al-Din survived, Algiers endured, and the great project passed onward through stronger hands and horizons. When news of Aruj fall reached Khayr al-Din, the tears he shed were not tears of collapse, but salt-washed vows promising unimaginable vengeance and towering future greatness beyond fear entirely. Khayr al-Din inherited Aruj not merely as corpse or memory, but as living spirit, transforming Algiers into colossal naval power, capable later of humiliating Europe's proudest fleets before history itself. The Andalusian Muslims rescued by Aruj built flourishing cities throughout North Africa while preserving memories of lost Andalusia, naming children after the liberator who shattered chains and restored breathing freedom. The Algeria constructed through his blood and labor evolved into force, haunting European monarchs for 3 uninterrupted centuries, until Algiers itself became synonymous with armed seas and undefeated resistance forever. His story taught history an unforgettable lesson. Empires are never built through waiting patiently for permission, but through audacity, relentless movement, and transforming ashes into fuel for greater victories ahead. His military doctrine stood clear as sunlight across calm waters. The sea was not transportation alone, but the true battlefield where initiative, speed, and courage ultimately govern human destinies and empires. The wars of attrition he fought transcended ordinary struggles over ports and coastlines. They targeted collective morale itself, because Aruj understood empires collapse once occupation becomes unbearably expensive and exhausting. His strategy of weaving alliances among tribes while constructing something greater than himself revealed political brilliance, matching military genius. Understanding isolated resistance cannot withstand imperial hordes forever without shared purpose and unity. Even his enemies described him with admiration shadowed by terror. Spanish chroniclers portrayed the one-armed warrior forging achievements beyond kings possessing complete bodies, armies, wealth, and imperial resources combined together. Modern military academies studying maritime guerrilla warfare and imperial exhaustion repeatedly encounter Aruj as enduring model, demonstrating how smaller forces exploit terrain and mobility against overwhelmingly superior adversaries and empires. The collective memory of North Africa still preserves his name through songs, proverbs, and stories repeated beside Mediterranean shores whenever sunset stains western horizons with dark crimson shades of remembrance and sacrifice. He left behind neither palaces, nor buried fortunes, nor grand-written volumes, but something infinitely more valuable, a living project inherited and expanded until Algeria itself became legend spanning 3 centuries. He fell within an unnamed valley, yet his name became immortal instead. Such is martyrdom's equation throughout history, where bodies collapse into dust while spirits continue wandering eternally above storming waves. Aruj Barbarossa died during May 1518, yet nowhere else truly perished, because every Muslim vessel crossing Mediterranean waters afterward carried fragments of the potter's son within its restless sails forever. The legend proclaimed that whoever begins within clay furnaces, rows chained inside prison galleys, then rises into lion of the sea, proves noble blood belongs only to sacrifice and conviction. At the conclusion of this epic chronicle, one question still echoes endlessly across Mediterranean waves each dawn. Who deserves mastery over these waters? Aru answered simply, those willing to bleed for dreams.